Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear participants. Welcome to this third session of the social Sharia that we had started last month. If you remember, we had covered two sessions, and in these two sessions, some of the topics that we covered related to nikah, relations prohibited for marriage, bounds and conditions of nikah, and the rights and obligations of spouses. So it is a very, very deeply interconnected topic. And also, this is something that we often come across, and the social sphere in which we interact with our brethren, not only in a way that we are interacting with them in the form of their own kind, but also we are interacting with them in the form of parents, in the form of spouse, in the form of children. So all these relations, they are very important, and at the same time, they are very delicately balanced in the Quran, and it is very important and very essential that each directive be understood with its due importance. So today we are going to start off with a topic which is something of it's something which we often laughingly discuss whenever this topic comes up, and it is as if something light has happened, some joke has been cracked, and this of course is something which when I would like to bring it up, it would be in a more serious way, so that we are able to discuss it in its ultimate form. And the issue at hand is the issue of polygamy, which means the marriage of a Muslim man with more than one wife, and or in fact what we call as multiple marriages. So this is an issue which is discussed in the Quran in Surah Nisa. And before I cite the verses, I would just like to point out the background of these verses, and also the background of polygamy vis-a-vis the Arabs and Arabia in the times of Prophet Muhammad and even before him. So you see, polygamy was a practice that was found in the Arab society much before the Prophet. It could go back centuries. So polygamy is something which was never introduced by the Quran, or it was never initiated in any way by the Quran. It was already a practice in vogue. It was already something which was a convention in the Arab society. So that is why Islam, or the Quran, I should say, when it talked about polygamy, it talked about something which is already introduced into society, and it used this directive to make way for certain reforms that were needed in those times. And we can say that in Medina, especially during the battles of Badr and Uhud, a lot of Muslim men were martyred, and as a result, we had a lot of widows and a lot of orphans in that society. So therefore, it was said that, well, people marry for various reasons. They marry for their own personal reasons, they marry for their own societal reasons, they marry to help individuals. There could be all sorts of motives for which people married in the pre-Quranic times. But the Quran said, well, one reason that believers should come forward and marry is to support the orphans. And for this, the best thing would be to marry their mothers, because no one better can be the person who can look after their needs and in their interests. So their own mothers, or in some cases even their sisters, would be the ones that they should marry, so that the purpose of looking after the orphans is met. And remember, a society in which there are a lot of orphans, this becomes a very precarious situation, and we didn't have those established governments of today, which has a system of social service. In fact, this is something which the Quran, although initiated in its own times, in its own way, in its own right, but here we have to understand that the issue of polygamy actually was discussed in the Quran as a solution to a problem that had arisen in Medina as a result of the battles of Badr and Uhud, in which a lot of Muslim believers, they had been martyred, and their children had been left as orphans, and their wives, of course, were widows. So the Quran came forward with this solution that you marry for other reasons. So one reason for which you could marry is to support these orphans. And for this, it said that it actually imposed a few conditions. The first condition which it imposed on these marriages was that people used to marry 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, they had, I mean, there was no restriction on the number of wives that you would have. But the Quran said that, well, the first restriction is that it should be just 4. I mean, you should not marry more than 4 women at one time. This was the first restriction that was made. And the second restriction was that this noble endeavor of supporting the orphans, and in order to do that, marrying at most 4 women, that too should be done if the purpose, or if justice is dispensed between all the 4 wives, or more than one wife in the other case. So this was also an allowance given only and only if justice could be dispensed, which meant that as far as the apparent treatment is concerned, for example, the amount of money that you would give for maintenance to a wife, or the time that you would allocate for a wife, and the rights of a wife should be equally distributed, and there should not be any injustice in this regard. Yes, one thing the Quran did specify, and we will read that verse, and it said that, well, it's not that this justice also means that you should love each wife equally, because something which relates to your heart and you have no control over it, that is not what is being meant. What is being meant here is, or what is being implied here is, that believers should treat their wives equally as far as their rights are concerned. And if this is not possible, then the Quran says that even for as noble an endeavor as supporting the orphans, people should restrict themselves to just one wife. And of course, as we will see from the verse, it also says that yes, you will have slave maidens also. But then, of course, this we will discuss, inshallah, in this chapter as we go along, that slavery was an inhuman institution which the Quran inherited in its own times, and it made a gradual progression. It offered a very gradual sequence to eradicate the institution of slavery. And until that eradication was done, of course, during that interim period, so slavery was always there. So this particular verse, when it says that you should marry one woman if you are not able to do justice with 4 wives, or you should also keep, look after the fact that you do have slave maidens or slave women. So that is something that we have to understand at the very outset. So let us first start having a glance at the verse, which actually tells us that as far as the Quran is concerned, in this regard, the important thing is that the whole issue has to be set into its proper background. So the words are, this is verse 3 and 4 of Surah Nisa. It says, وَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ أَلَّا تُقْسِطُوا فِي الْيَتَامَى فَانْكِحُوا مَا تَابَ لَكُم مِّنَ النِّسَاءِ مَثْنَى وَثُلَاثَ وَرُبَاعَ فَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ أَلَّا تَعْدِلُوا فَوَاحِدَةً أَوْ مَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُكُمْ ذَلِكَ أَدْنَىٰ أَلَّا تَعُولُوا وَآتُوا النِّسَاءَ صَدُقَاتِهِنَّ نِحْلًا فَإِنْ طِبْنَ لَكُمْ عَنْ شَيْءٍ مِّنْهُ نَفْسًا فَكُلُوهُ هَنِيئًا مَرِيئًا. And if you fear that you shall not be able to deal justly with the orphans, marry their mothers who are lawful to you, 2, 3, 4. But if you fear that you shall not be able to deal justly with them, then only one, or those which your right hands possess. This, of course, refers to the slave maidens. That will be more suitable to prevent you from doing injustice. And give these women their dowers also the way dowers are given. But if they of their own good pleasure remit any part of it to you, take it and consume it gladly. So one thing which the Quran has very, very strongly stressed here is that even in such cases, a person might think that, well, he's doing a favor in marrying someone to support her child. The Quran says even in such a case, you should not think that this is a concession in not paying the dower to that lady. The dower has to be given, because the dower is a symbolism of the fact that the person has decided to be the financial person responsible for the upkeep and the economic upkeep of his wife. So even in this condition, when he is trying to support an orphan, this particular condition cannot be revoked. So he has to pay the dower. And as the verse says at the end, that however, if women of their own pleasure they remit or give some concession, then of course they can settle for something less. But I mean, if the lady who is a widow and she has children who are orphans, if she's going to marry that widow, then unless she herself remits a part of that dower, the person who is marrying is still bound to pay the dower as what is settled between the two. So the second important verse in this regard is that I'm just going to read out before you, relates to that situation which I just described earlier on, that as far as this justice is concerned, it does not relate to justice in your emotions as well, because this is something which is virtually impossible. So the Quran says, وَإِنِ امْرَأَةٌ خَافَتْ مِنْ بَعْلِهَا نُشُوزًا أَوْ إِعْرَاضًا فَلَا جُنَاحَ عَلَيْهِمَا أَنْ يُصْلِحَا بَيْنَهُمَا صُلْحًا وأحضرت الأنفس الشح وإن تحسنوا وتتقوا فإن الله كان بما تعملون خبيرا. And if any of these women fear cruelty or neglect on her husband's part, there is no blame on the two of them if they arrange an amicable settlement between themselves, and they should consider that such a settlement is best. And in reality, man is greedy by nature. But if you do good and practice self-restraint, you should rest assured that Allah is well acquainted with all that you do. So in this regard, as has been the case in the previous verse, that if the wife thinks that, well, if she demands the full dower, that would ultimately result in the husband showing showing cruelty or neglect, then if she remits a part of it, then of course the Quran says there is no blame on the two. And again, the words are وَصُلْحُ خَيْرٌ, that the real thing is that an amicable settlement is the best. So although the lady can remit a part of the dower that is incumbent for her to take, the spirit is that the husband actually should not, matters should not reach this extent, and the husband should be willingly, he should be willing to pay the complete dower. However, if the wife says, then yes. As far as the verse is concerned regarding concession in those emotions are concerned, that is verse 127 of Surah Nisa, and it says, وَلَن تَسْتَطِيعُوا أَن تَعْدِلُوا بَيْنَ النِّسَاءِ وَلَوْ حَرَصْتُمْ. It says that however much you might try, you will not be able to be just to your wives regarding your emotional attachment to them. So you cannot be equally attached to all your wives at the same time. And says that this should not be the case. However, this should not be the case that you lean towards one wife so much that you leave the others in a state of, so that you're not even caring for them or her, whatever the case may be, in the appropriate way. So the Quran has given this concession that rights, of course, which relate to these wives and women, they have to be dispensed with, they have to be equally discharged, and they should be equal justice. And something less than that is not even, not even a starting point. However, what the concession is that, and this is verse 127 of Surah Nisa, it tells us that basically, as far as the Quran is concerned, it says that your own personal attachment is not something in which the Quran expects that you have equal attachment with all the wives. Yes, you can be more attached to one wife, but then the rights of each of the wives must be fulfilled. Now, there are some people who argue and say that perhaps the way that the Quran has mentioned this whole episode seems that only in the case of orphans should people marry more than one wife. Otherwise, the Quran does not allow them to marry more than one wife. And now this is an inference which is actually incorrect, because had it been correct, the only reason or the only scenario in which it could have been correct is if the Quran was for the first time initiating the issue of polygamy, and polygamy was something that was starting at that time. That is not the case. Polygamy was a practice already rampant in the Arab society, and people were marrying for various causes. So the Quran said, "Will you marry for various reasons and for various causes? Be more magnanimous and marry for this reason as well, in order to support these orphans." So this would be an incorrect inference if some people say that multiple marriages are only allowed, of course, until 4. They are only allowed if the issue is to support the orphans. this would not be a correct conclusion. The correct inference here is that people can marry for whatever reason they want to, but of course this is also one reason that they should consider. So there could be other reasons, but this is one reason, and we know that the Prophet actually took lead in this, and we know from history that in the battles of Badr and Uhud, when, as I said, a lot of Muslim men were martyred and their wives became widows. So this appeal that the Quran made, of course, the first person to respond to this appeal was the Prophet himself. And he married the daughter of Umar anhu, Hafsa anha, and Salama, both of whom had husbands who had fought these wars and had been martyred in these wars. So the Prophet took lead so that other Muslim men would also come forward and marry women who had been widowed as a result. So this is as far as the issue of polygamy is concerned. I mean, neither is the Quran encouraging Muslims to marry more than one wife and go right up to 4, nor is it discouraging them. All that it is doing is it is allowing them that, well, you can marry, but of course this marriage, the way it was discussed in the Quran was for a reason. But that is one reason which the Quran has discussed. Otherwise, marriage or multiple marriages of a Muslim man with a Muslim woman can go up to 4, and they could be for any reason. The justice, of course, is something between the wives that is the supreme condition that has to be met. And of course, this is absolutely, it's like a knife edge on which a person would stand if he takes this decision. So he has to be absolutely sure that he will be doing justice to all those 4 wives. Otherwise, the Quran says that even such a noble gesture as marrying widows for this cause should not be followed, and it should be abstained from. So now, taking cue from this issue of polygamy, we will also discuss the issue of the wives of the Prophet, because of course he had also wives, and they were in excess of 4. So the question is that how come the Prophet he married more than 4 wives, and whereas the Muslims or the common believers, they were just allowed to do so in the case of 4 women. And the Quran has made this a subject of its, the topic is discussed in detail in Surah Ahzab, so that there should be no confusion. And presently we will going to see that as well and discuss what we gain from that. But at the same time, one thing that you might need to note are these words of the Quran, which we are just going to read. It says, "Khalisatan laka min dunil mu'mineen." It says that this exception of the Prophet marrying beyond 4 wives is just for him. Khalisatan lak, it's just purely for him, min dunil mu'mineen, away from the believers. They are not given this position, this permission. And also the reason that has been spelled out for this concession is that the Prophet is able to discharge his duties as a prophet and a messenger of God. So it was basically as a messenger of God and prophet of God that there were certain extra duties that were imposed on him, and as a result he was required to follow those. And in the consequence of following those directives was this permission given to him that he could marry more than 4 wives for reasons that we are just going to study. So the Quran says, this is verse 37 of Surah Ahzab, وَإِذْ تَقُولُ لِلَّذِي أَنْعَمَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَأَنْعَمْتَ عَلَيْهِ أَمْسِكْ عَلَيْكَ زَوْجَكَ وَاتَّقِ اللَّهَ وَتُخْفِي فِي نَفْسِكَ مَا اللَّهُ مُبْدِيهِ وَتَخْشَى النَّاسَ وَاللَّهُ أَحَقُّ أَنْ تَخْشَاهُ فَلَمَّا قَضَى زَيْدٌ مِّنْهُ وَطَرًا زَوَّجْنَاكَهَا لِكَيْ لَا يَكُونَ عَلَى الْمُؤْمِنِينَ حَرَجٌ فِي أَزْوَاجِ أَدْعِيَائِهِمْ إِذَا قَضَوْا مِنْهُنَّ وَطَرًا وَكَانَ أَمْرُ اللَّهِ مَفْعُولًا. So this is the first marriage which the Prophet undertook. And as the Quran says, وَزَوَّجْنَاكَهَا, the Almighty says that we wedded her to you. Of course, referring to Zainab bint Jahash, who was the Prophet's cousin sister. And she was also married to Zayd bin Harisa, who was the adopted free son, who was a freed slave and adopted son of the Prophet himself. So before marrying Zainab bint Jahash, which was his 5th wife, the Prophet had 4 wives. Khadija had died, and the Prophet had married Salama, of course. He had married Aisha, and he had married Hafsa, and he had also married Zainab bint Khuzaymah. And we know that Zainab bint Khuzaymah had died later on as well during the Prophet's own lifetime. So this was his fifth wife when these verses were revealed, and the Quran said that because of the fact that Zayd ibn Haris, because of the Arab custom in those times, that a person could not marry the wife of his adopted son. And this was a custom that went on. I mean, it was practiced in Arabia. And because the Prophet was the last messenger of God, so it had to be set right. Because marriage with only your real son's wife is prohibited. That is what the Quran has said. And all other relations in this regard, I mean, if they come, we have to understand that if you have an adopted child, an adopted son, the way Zayd ibn Harisa was, and he had married a wife, someone, and if he divorces her, then of course she would be absolutely fine to be married by the person. And this whole marriage also has a background, and that background is that the Prophet wanted, of course, to elevate the status of slaves as well. So we can in fact summarize it by saying that there were two basic objectives. One was, of course, to do away with this law that you could not marry the wife of your adopted son, because of course it was against nature. Only real sons' wives are prohibited. And the second objective was that he could be, the institution of slavery could be given this uplift, because now the Prophet's cousin, who was Zainab bint Jahash, she was convinced by the Prophet to marry Zayd ibn Harisa, because of course Zayd ibn Harisa was the Prophet's slave. He was freed by the Prophet, he was liberated by him, and then he was adopted by him as his son. So in order to uplift the concepts that you can marry a person of such a category as well, the Prophet undertook this. And in spite of his very well thought of wishes that he would like to have, he would like to have that son of his, the adopted son of his, who was originally a slave, married to a free woman, and thereby raising the status of slaves in the society. In spite of this well wish, in spite of this very, very, very apt concern, the marriage could not work out, unfortunately. And although the Prophet wanted it to work out, and Zayd ibn Harisa even wanted the Prophet wanted him not to give divorce to Zainab bint Jahsh, because he knew the consequences of what these were. But the Quran has here stated that once this was done, then the Prophet himself was ordered by the Almighty, and the Quran says, وَزَوَّجْنَاكَهَا فَلَمَّا قَضَى زَيْدٌ مِنْهَا وَطَرًا. And of course, Zayd is the only, this is incidentally, this might come to your knowledge, that the only companion of the Prophet ever mentioned by name in the Quran is Zayd ibn Harisa, and that too because of the reason that I just stated. So the word Zayd, as you can see, is not any Zayd, it's Zayd ibn Harisa. So the Quran says that when Zayd broke his relationship with her, we joined her in marriage to you, so that in future there may be no difficulty on the believers in the matter of marriage with the wives of their adopted sons. So this is something that the Prophet did. Now, with this, of course, a whole law was then revealed regarding the marriages of Prophet Muhammad. And as I said, they were specifically meant for him. So the words are, Ya ayyuhan nabiyyu inna ahlalna laka azwajaka allati atayta ujurahunna wa ma malakat yaminuka mimma afa Allahu alayka wa banati ammika wa banati ammatika wa banati khalika wa banati khalatik allati hajarna ma'ak wa mara'atan وامرأة مؤمنة إن ذهبت نفسها وامرأة مؤمنة إن وهبت نفسها للنبي إن أراد النبي أن يستنكحها خالصة لك من دون المؤمنين قد علمنا ما فرضنا عليهم في أزواجهم وما ملكت أيمانهم لكي لا يكون عليك حرج وكان الله غفورا رحيما. And I'm just going to translate first this part, and then we can move on to the rest of the verse. O Prophet, we have made lawful to you the wives whom you have paid their dowers, and free women whom God gives you in your possession because of a military campaign, and the daughters of your paternal uncles and aunts, and the daughters of your maternal uncles and aunts who migrated from Mecca with you, and any believing woman who gifts her soul to the Prophet on the condition that the Prophet wishes to marry her. This directive is specifically for you alone and not for the believers. So here is that restriction. We very well know what we have imposed on them as obligations regarding their wives and slave girls, a special directive for you so that there be no difficulty for you in discharging your duties, and in case of any blemish, Allah is forgiving and merciful. So the verse goes on. In fact, these are 3 verses. So the next part is ترجي من تشاء منهن وتؤوي إليك من تشاء ومن ابتغيت ممن عزلت فلا جناح عليك ذلك أدنى أن تقر أعينهن ولا يحزن ويرضين بما آتيتهن كلهن والله يعلم ما في قلوبكم وكان الله عليما حكيما لا يحل لك النساء من بعد ولا أن تبدل بهن من أزواج ولو أعجبك حسنهن إلا ما ملكت يمينك وكان الله على كل شيء رقيبا. You have the authority to keep any of them away from you and keep any of them near you, and it is lawful to you to bring any of them near you whom you have kept away. There is no blame on you in this regard. This explanation is more proper so that they be contented and not be sorrowful and feel satisfied with whatever you give all of them. And Allah knows what is in your hearts, and Allah is all-knowing and most forbearing. All other women besides these are not lawful for you, nor can you change them for other wives, even though their beauty attracts you. Slave girls, however, are still allowed to you, and in reality, Allah does watch over all things. So if we study this verse in detail, and as Ustaz Javed Ahmed Ghamidi in his book has analyzed them, he has said that basically there are 3 categories of women that are discussed here, about whom the Prophet has said that he can marry amongst these 3 categories, and all the other categories are forbidden to him. And at the same time, because of the fact that this whole exercise was, or this concession, or this, we should not even call it a concession, it was a responsibility in fact. So this responsibility of marrying, in case he thought that it was important to marry, was something that made him, lift the conditions of justice. So the Almighty lifted the conditions of justice on the Prophet between his wives, because of the fact that he was not doing it for any other purpose except for the purpose of prophethood and messengerhood. And at the same time, the restriction was imposed on him that he could not divorce any of his wives, and he could not marry beyond these 3 categories. And these 3 categories have been summed up by him. So, to honor free women who were caught as captives in some military campaigns, this was the first category. Second was to show kind-heartedness to women who wanted to marry him just for the sake of associating themselves to him. And for this reason, they were ready to gift themselves to him. So this is what we call as wahaba. This is the mawhibat, which means that you do not require any rights from the Prophet or any obligations from the Prophet. You're just associating yourselves with him. And the third was to console and sympathize with his maternal and paternal cousin sisters who had migrated with him from Mecca and left their houses and their relatives, merely to support and back him. So therefore, we have to understand that as far as these 3 categories are concerned, he was just allowed to marry from amongst these categories. So as far as the first category is concerned, that women who are caught as captives in some military campaigns, we know that Safiya radhiyallahu anha and Javeria radhiyallahu anha are the 2 women who were freed by the Prophet in these military campaigns respectively, and separately. So one, we know Safiya was captured in the Battle of Khaybar, and Javeria in the Battle of Bani Mustalaq. And both these battles went, and at the same time they were freed, and they were asked for their consent. So it was not that the Prophet was imposing something on them. It was through their consent that the Prophet married them, because of course they were the daughters of the chiefs of their tribes, and to set them free, of course, in this manner, and the Prophet asking them for their hands was, again, in relation to the fact that as his responsibility being the last Prophet of God, it was essential that for such women of this caliber, only he could have accommodated them. So this is the offer that he made to both these women, and they accepted, and the Prophet was married with both. And then we have this category to show kind-heartedness to women who wanted to marry, and under this category he married Habiba, who was the daughter of the Prophet's uncle Abu Sufyan. So we know that he married her because she had migrated with him, and she had to go through a lot of bothers and troubles, and the Prophet, in order to console her, did so. And then the third thing was of course, women who wanted to gift themselves to him. This is the second category. I discussed the third before the second. So under this, Maimuna Radhiyallahu anha was married by the Prophet, and she wanted herself to be associated. She did not demand any rights from the Prophet. All that she wanted was to have herself in the company of the Prophet and try to be his companion. So this is as far as the marriages are concerned. So we can see that as far as the Prophet's marriages are concerned, all of them were done as a result, or they were conducted as a result of these three objectives. And all these three objectives were objectives because of his prophet and messenger responsibility, in which women who were supporting him, they had to be backed. Of course, Zainab bint Jahash being an exception, that was the case that we've just discussed, that she was the woman that the Prophet had to marry, because when Zayd ibn Harisa divorced her, and she was also someone who belonged to a very high class family and a very noble family, and she was so shocked that someone would give her divorce, that the only way to console her was the Prophet himself marry her. So he ended up marrying Zainab bint Jahash. And of course, we have already discussed Salama and Hafsa. Hafsa was the daughter of Umar radhiyallahu anhu. So the Prophet married these two before this directive was revealed of more than 4 marriages, and both of them were conducted as a result of the wars that had taken place in Arabia in those times. And prior to that, Sauda and Aisha and Khadija were also married to the Prophet, but Khadija had died. So at the time of the revelation of the verse in which Zainab bint Jahash was married, the Prophet had four wives. So he had Aisha, he had Sauda, he had Salama and Hafsa. And these were the 4 regulations regulatory wise, I would say, as a result of which all Muslims were given the same permission. But after that, the 5th and the 6th and so on were something which the Quran said that now you have to fulfill a certain mission. And for this mission, the first one that you will marry is Zainab bint Jahash, her own cousin sister. And of course, the Prophet also married Zainab bint Khuzaima. She died, we know that, during the Prophet's own lifetime. But the 3 categories that in which we can see that the Prophet then married were these 3 categories which I have just spelled out. So therefore, Juwairiya and Safiya was married as a result of the military campaigns that were launched against the Banu Mustalik and the people of Khaybar. Maimuna was the person or the lady who gifted herself to the Prophet, which meant that she did not demand any rights from him, and she just wanted to remain associated with him. And as far as his cousin sisters are concerned, who migrated with him and bore a lot of difficulties, this was one category which the Prophet was allowed, and under that category he married he married Habiba, who was the daughter of Abu Sufyan. So you can clearly see that with these, the Prophet was also told that he could not marry, beyond this category, and he could not divorce any of these wives as well. He could not divorce any of these wives, and they were regarded as the mothers of the faithful, and no one could marry them after him. And we find this that they were regarded as the mothers of the believers. So the Quran says, "An-Nabi awla bil mu'minina min anfusihim wa azwajuhu ummahatuhum." So all the wives of the Prophet were regarded as the mothers of the believers. The Prophet holds priority for the believers over their own selves, and his wives are their mothers. وَلَا تَنْكِحُوا أَزْوَاجَهُ مِنْ بَعْدِهِ أَبَدًا إِنَّ ذَلِكُمْ كَانَ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ عَظِيمًا. Nor is it right for you that you should marry his widows after him at any time. Truly, such a thing is abominable in Allah's sight. So because they were the mothers of the believers, when the Prophet passed away, they could not marry anyone. No one could marry them, because their status of being the mothers of the believers had to be left intact. So with these restrictions, there were certain latitudes as well which were given to the Prophet in order for him to accomplish his mission. And this also brings us to this conclusion that none of these marriages were by any means or by any stretch of imagination done because of any indulgence or any lust that people sometimes blame the Prophet with. So all these were something which were done for certain purposes. In fact, if I can elaborate, I can say that the only marriage which the Prophet did out of his own accord was with Khadija. The rest were all contingent. So Aisha and Sauda came together because the person who was actually looking for the Prophet, looking out for the Prophet, I would say, her name was Khawla. She actually ended up giving both Aisha and Sauda, their parents, the Prophet's intention that he would like to marry. Of course, it was not the Prophet's intention. He did not even know them. Know them in this sense. It was Khawla who brought their case before the Prophet, and she said that she knows someone who is an elderly, and she also knows someone who is young. And should she go and ask for them? And the Prophet said yes. And she actually went to Aisha radhiyallahu anhu's father, who was Abu Bakr radhiyallahu anhu. Abu Bakr, he was very. He could not believe this because he thought that, people thought that he was his, but he himself thought he was brother Aisha. Prophet was his brother, Abu Bakr's brother, and it was something that would be unbecoming. But later on, when it was realized that it is absolutely perfect, and also we know that in the age of Jahiliyyah, her hand had been given to another person. So Abu Bakr initially he refused, and so Khawla then went to Sauda, who was an elderly lady. Sauda immediately said yes, and the purpose of bringing, of course, either of them was the Prophet had young children at that time, and that was why he had actually even asked or even thought about it. And remember, it was not even initiated by him; it was initiated by Khawla herself. So when the Prophet gave consent to Sauda, in the meantime, Aisha was also, Abu Bakr thought of the fact, and he ended up actually saying yes to this as well. And now the Prophet was in this situation that he had accepted Sauda, and suddenly he came to know that Abu Bakr was also now convinced that he showed his consent that he would marry his daughter. And when this happened, he could not refuse him as well. For this, because of course this would have been very unbecoming, and would have been slightly disrespectful as well, because he was his companion. So it was like in a situation like this that the Prophet had to marry her as well. And I have already discussed elsewhere, but I may repeat it here as well, that as far as the age of Aisha is concerned, which is generally thought of to be as a 6-year-old or a 9-year-old, this is absolutely incorrect. So as far as these narratives are concerned, if you look at these narratives, there are narratives in Bukhari which do say that she was 6 or 9 years old and she used to play with dolls. But if you look at history, you'll find there's an alternative evidence which is very glaring and which tells us that Aisha at her marriage was 19 or 20 years of age. And the evidence which all history books cite is very simple. It's more of a mathematical calculation that we can do. So Aisha's elder sister, we know, she was, of course, someone who was 10 years older to her, and as far as she was concerned, her age at the time of her death was 72, and she died in 100 Hijrah. So her name, we all know, is Asma. So Asma, who is the elder sister of Aisha, one fact which history books tell us is that she was 10 years older to Aisha. And the second fact which the history books tell us is that that Asma, that she died at the ripe old age of 100 in 72 or 73 Hijrah. Which means that at the time of migration, of course, Asma would be 27 years old, because if she died in 73 Hijrah at the age of 100, so automatically at the time of migration, she would be 27 years old. Now, the other thing which I just discussed was that she was 10 years older to Aisha. This would mean that at the time of migration, Asma was 27, just saw that, and Aisha was 10 years old, was 17 years old. She was 10 years less. So one was 27 and the other was 17. And we also know from history that the Prophet married Aisha a couple of years after he moved to Medina. A couple of years after he moved to Medina, and the marriage was consummated after that. So if we add those 2 years, it becomes 19. So it was she at that age was 19 years old, and of course that's a marriageable age, and it is absolutely incorrect to believe that she was 6 or 9 years old. So coming back to the original equation, we just saw that the Prophet married Khadija, she passed away, and then Sauda came to, she was someone for whom, the destiny took the Prophet to her, and at the same time it took her to Aisha as well, because initially her father refused, and later on it was decided that yes, she will be she'll say a yes to the Prophet, and Abu Bakr actually got convinced as a result as well. So we had those two, and then of course the Prophet married two women from the battles of Uhud and Badr, who became widows. He also married Zainab bint Khuzaimah, and then and she passed away. So as a result, the Prophet had now 4 wives, and when the 5th wife was to be added to him as in marriage, we know that Zainab bint Jahash, who was his cousin sister, she was the one who was married to him as a result of reforming that institution in which a person could not marry the daughter of his adopted son. And at the same time, of course, the Prophet had this expediency before him, or this wisdom and reason before him, to lift or uplift the status of slaves. And then the rest of the wives, of course, they were married as a result of the fact that when Zainab was divorced by Zayd ibn Harisa, she was married as a cousin sister of the Prophet. He married her as a result of that, because in order to console her from this episode that she had suffered. Then the woman who gifted herself to the Prophet, which actually means that she would demand no rights, was Maimuna. And then 2 other ladies who were married to him were Juwairiya and Safiya, and both of them were the daughters of 2 leaders. And of course, this was done out of their consent once they were freed. So all in all, we can see that it was basically this burden of prophethood, and initially, of course, to run his own house after he was left in a situation high and dry when he lost his first wife, Khadija. So all this is enough to tell us that as far as his wives are concerned, they were, out of his own consent, we can clearly see that he just married Khadija. The rest followed as a result of one reason or the other. It was not any other except certain contingent causes, or appeal from the Quran, or, as I said, to set right a practice that had to be set right because he was the last prophet. One more thing that I would like to say here before we finish off, and you can ask questions regarding what we have discussed, is yes, that the Prophet also had a slave woman, and her name was Maria the Copt, and she was gifted to the Prophet from the king of Egypt, Makaukas. And the Prophet was, of course, someone that when he was gifted, when some woman was gifted to her as a slave lady, he married her. He kept her as a slave lady, did not marry her, because the important thing that we have to realize is that in order to make an example before other believers, that unless and until they set free those slave ladies, there should be someone who should set an example, set the standard of how to treat slave women that live in your house. So we know from history that Maria the Copt, although she was a slave lady, but she virtually enjoyed the same status and rights as a wife. Yes, the Prophet did not marry her, but he gave her such respect and honor that he virtually, not really, virtually became his wife. And this was an example to be set before other believers, that until the time that slavery was completely abolished in the next few years, until the time that believers would be keeping wives, they should look at the Prophet, at how he has kept Maria the Copt. And we know that Ibrahim, the son of the Prophet, and Qasim were born from her actually. And that is something that we know. And as far as the original debate is concerned regarding the wives of the Prophet, I think it does stand closed from these verses of the Quran, because they clearly tell us how important it was for the mission of the Prophet, and it was for the overall cause that these marriages were conducted. So inshallah, we'll continue with this session next week, in which we will discuss some of the other topics which relate to the social Sharia. But for now, if you have any questions regarding what we have covered, please raise them.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saleem, for covering this very important topic. We have a question that asks, what is meant by free a slave? When institute of slavery was dissolved by God, then every slave should have become free. So
Right.
why do you have to say that we need to free them?
So, because you see, slavery was an institution that was deeply ingrained in the Arab society. It was deeply ingrained. It was part and parcel of the Arab society. And there were a lot of slave men and women who were dependent on the houses that they lived and worked in. And had they been set free immediately, women would have had no choice but to go to prostitution and earn for themselves because they had no other means. And men, of course, they would have just become beggars in the society. So the Quran adopted a gradual way so that in this gradual way, people would start accommodating them, they would start freeing them slowly. And then, in about 10 or 15 years, right near the Prophet's death, the Quran announced in Surah Nur that you have to free all the slaves who demand their liberation. You cannot keep them. Only those can be kept who themselves, out of their own accord. Remember, there were families who were living because of their fathers and grandparents and great grandparents. All of them were living in that family, and it had become a tradition to live in the family, and they had become so used to the family, and some of them were so old also that they virtually preferred to stay with the family that they were serving. So, except for them, slave women and men who demanded their own liberation after those years of initial gradual elimination, it was incumbent that they be liberated. So the reason that it was not immediately dissolved was what I just stated, that they had to be trained, they had to be made useful individuals in the society, and this happened right near the death of the Prophet. So this was that interim period in which slavery was allowed, and once that period ended, the Quran, as I said in Surah Nur, announced that every single slave, man or woman, who would like to get free was given this authority. It's like an authority letter given in their hands that they could free themselves and live as independent
Thank
and
you.
free individuals.
Thank you, Dr. Saleem. The next question asks, was a directive not enough to allow marriage with an adopted son's divorce, like adopted son, rather than forcing his daughter to marry his adopted son?
Well, actually, this is something of an interest that you might know, because you see, there were two reasons. One was to uplift the standard of slaves. So people were afraid in marrying slaves. They were not afraid, I would say, they were hesitant. Because you see, there was such class difference and class bifurcation in the Arab society that even if they were freed by someone, they still had that label of being a slave in their past lives. So people never wished to marry someone who was a slave in his past life. So the dream of the Prophet was that his own cousin should marry him, and this would actually uplift the whole institution of slavery. And at the same time, as I said, this was also something which would which would take care of that institution in which people would be allowed to marry the wives of their adopted sons. So had the Prophet not taken this initiative, the first thing that would have suffered would be, as I said, that this institution, the way he wanted it to become elevated in the society, would have had its own toll. And the second, of course, was that as far as slavery is concerned, as far as this institution is concerned, we have to understand that this was something that was deeply ingrained in the Arab society. And if had the Prophet not taken the initiative in marrying her, she would have broken down. The Prophet himself, as the Quran says, the reason is to console them. Basically, the amount of damage that was done to her, the emotional damage, that could have only been compensated if the Prophet had asked her hand in return. Otherwise, there was no one else who could have married her, and the extent of wound that was, so to speak, that was inflicted on her heart could have been repaired. So it was the Prophet himself who had insisted Zainab to marry Zaid, and once at his behest, because of his suggestion, this marriage could not carry on, he felt that he was responsible for this marriage not continuing. So this burden also laid heavily upon him. And in fact, he did not want to do this. He did not want to marry her because he thought that this would cause a great scandal in the society. But look what the Quran says. The Quran says that you fear people, that they might, they might bring you to nothing, or they might, they would humiliate you or show you disrespect that you've married the daughter of your, the wife of your adopted son. No, it is our order that you do so, so that this would also console the heart of Zainab, and at the same time, unless you do it, in spite of the fact that it's like an allowance given, unless someone takes the first step, it would remain a theoretical thing. Someone had to demonstrate it as well. So this is what comes to my mind as far as the Quran is concerned in this regard.
Dr. Saleem. Shabnam, please go ahead.
जी अस्सलाम वालेकुम सर।
Walaikum salam.
सर हिस्टोरिक सर आपने कहा कि prophet was not allowed to divorce any of his wives, तो सर
जी
हिस्ट्री में मिलता है कि हजरत he wanted to divorce हजरत सौदा in the later years, और लेकिन उन्होंने she requested और उन्होंने अपनी टर्न जो डे की थी वो हजरत आयशा को दे दी थी, तो is it true?
I don't think so. This cannot be true. It's against the Quran. This is what we read in history. He could not have divorced, according to these verses, any of these wives.
Then sir, why did she give her turn to Hazrat Aisha?
Because she was old. I mean, this was very, very understandable that she was slightly old, and also the Prophet, all the wives knew that Aisha was his beloved wife, and they respected the Prophet's wishes. And she wanted to remain associated. Remember, she did not demand any rights in the first place. I mean, like Maimuna is Allah anha. Yes, she did not demand any rights. Sauda, when she came to the Prophet, she was already a lady, a majestic lady of almost 55 years. I mean, that was the time when she got married to him. So during his later years, of course, she would have been even more older. So just to, give this comfort to the Prophet that she might have done this.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Saleem. Adil Qureshi, please go ahead. Adil, you're up next.
जी अस्सलाम वालेकुम डॉक्टर साहब।
Walaikum salam.
सो सर ये जो डायरेक्टिव था कुरान में, एक देयर इज अ डायरेक्टिव इन कुरान वेयर द वाइव्स ऑफ द प्रॉफिट आर आल्सो were given an option. If they want to leave prophet, they can leave him now. Otherwise, if they want to stay, they can stay. And then there's another directive which says that they are not allowed to marry anybody else after the passing away of the prophet. So was the first directive?
Yes, this was before this. Yes, this was before these verses, and this was the time in which they were given this option that some extra restrictions would be imposed on them because of their stature, and if they think that this is something they could not bear, then at this very instance they should call it a day. But none of them did actually. None of them took this offer, and all of them said that we are with you, O Prophet, and we will be by your side all the time, eternally, as long as you live.
After they took the decision, then it was banned for anybody to marry
Yes.
them.
After they took this decision, we found these. I mean, these verses were revealed after them, obviously. So these verses which say that you cannot marry the mothers. I mean, the wives of the Prophet, they are like your mothers. They were declared as the mothers of the faithful first, and this happened after that initial incident, in which this offer was given to them.
Okay, I have another question as well, Mariam.
You can go ahead.
So, sir, sorry, I forgot the name. Hazrat Maria was the name of the
Slave lady.
the slave lady, the concubine. So इस पर एक मुशरिकीन का एतराज़ है, अगर आपके सामने मैं वो पेश करूं, कि हम कहते हैं कि नबी सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि वसल्लम का जो उसवा है, नबी सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि वसल्लम का जो behavior है, that is supposed to be the best for all the mankind because he was the last prophet. So he is supposed to show us the best possible way to do anything. Now, for a man, if he's gifted a concubine, the best possible action that you can do is to maybe free her, set her up with a good man, marry them together, and convert her into a wife living in the society. The second best behavior is probably that you can still marry her, keep her as a concubine, and show how best you can still treat the concubines. So why did the Prophet not choose the first option, which would have been probably the best possible option for the concubines, and then show the rest of the moments around his time as well that this is how this should be done?
Because you see, there was one important thing that we are all missing, and that was that yes, many of them were inspired to liberate these women of their own accord, but there were some people who were still going to exist with these slave women until that final directive of giving up all the slaves was revealed. So until that time, there were still a lot of people who still would have those slave women, and they were maltreated, and I mean not maltreated, but they were treated in a way that was not very nice to say. So someone had to show them that if you have to keep a slave in this interim period, then this is how it should be done. So this was, again, as you just said, to set that example. His example was to be followed, that if you have to keep a slave lady, then this is how you should keep a slave lady, that she virtually enjoys the same status and same respect, I would say, though not in the real sense because she was not married, but she had virtually the same status and rights as a married woman would have. So this was like setting an example for those Muslim believers, men, who would still have slave maidens until, of course, the last directive of liberating them would arrive. Someone had to take care of that as well.
Yes, sir. I'll think more on it. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we'll take chat questions and then come back to raised hands. So this question asks, was there a reason why the Prophet couldn't divorce his wives?
Was there a reason because he could not divorce his wife? Yes, because of the fact that they were now given into his custody, and they had to remain with him all the time because of the services they were be rendering. So therefore, he could not change his any other them for any other wife, because the category has been defined. He could not have gone beyond this category, and among this category also, once these wives came to him, he could not divorce them, because a widowed mother of the faithful is something which the Prophet, a divorced mother of the faithful is something which the Almighty did not like that this should be a case. Yes, they could become widows, but being divorced and then still being declared as the mothers of the faithful would have been a very difficult proposition.
Thank you, Dr. Saleem. The next question asks, what is the concept of marriage of choice in Islam? Did such cases happen between the companions of the Holy Prophet? What should we do if we like a girl?
If it's you have to understand at the very outset that marriage is by the choice of the two individuals who are going to get married. All the rest are not, they don't have the final say. And this is precisely what was practiced in the times of the Prophet as well. Without consent, the Prophet severely reprimanded those people who, without seeking the consent of their daughter or their son, would proceed forth. At times, we do have incidents in which he did not, he actually reprimanded one of the fathers that if he have done something against the wish of his daughter, then he should revert back to what the daughter wishes. So at the outset, we must realize that it is the consent of the two who are getting married that has the final say. The rest are all suggestions. So if a person wants to get married to a lady, or a lady wants to get married to a boy or a man, both have the freedom of choice to do so. And obviously, they will try to communicate this desire to their parents. And in most cases, I should think that this is a reason enough for the family to accept them, because remember, the choice is theirs. The choice is of the boy and the girl, not the. The parents can have their suggestions, they can give their advice, but ultimately they have to settle for what the choice is made by the two people. So I think that the questioner should, it should be clear to him or her that this is their own consent that is going to be final in this case.
Thank you, Dr. Saleem. The next question asks, was that a wise decision to marry a woman from a ruling elite to a freed slave, i.e. the Prophet, having such a mismatched marriage with different women from different socioeconomic statuses? Wouldn't that increase the likelihood of getting divorced?
So remember, this is something which the Prophet, when he did, it was not done out of any coercion. No one was forced to marry him. It was out of their own free consent. And later on, we can clearly see that, none of them ever showed that this was a bad decision or a wrong decision. And in the Arab society of those times, women like Safiya and Javeria, the two, they're the daughters of two leaders of their own times. Both were Jewish leaders. And the Prophet, we know that as far as they are concerned, they're all out of their own consent. They accepted religion. They accepted to marry the Prophet. So this is a mismatch could only be could have imagined in any case if the disparity in the economic conditions were great. But remember, the Prophet himself was the ruler of the Muslims at those times, and these two women were leaders, the daughters of a leader at least. And I've just described how the rest came to become his wives. So I think if the question is regarding each of the wives to be taken separately, we can discuss each of them and see that how that compatibility factor was there in some form or the other. And the biggest thing is that what we need to also understand is that, this is apart from what we have just discussed, that marriage in itself is a gamble. It's not that you have to always understand the other person in a way that you think that he or her and your ideas have to match 100%. This is it's more of wishful thinking, I would say. A marriage, in fact, is a marriage in which you marry as a result of the consent of the opposite part and as a result of some common objective. And if this objective is there, then a lot of differences are sorted out because of the fact that each spouse realizes that it's a marriage of two people of different backgrounds coming together and having a purpose in that. So I think this is apart from the question that I explained, that marriage, whatever it be, apart from the marriage of the Prophet, even if they are a perfect match vis-a-vis the society, vis-a-vis the status, vis-a-vis the conditions, 100% match in this would also not guarantee any success, because once a person gets married, the personality of the wife or the husband which comes forth as a result is entirely different from what you might have known them prior to that.
Thank you, Dr. Saleem. I actually misunderstood the question. The questioner said that they're referring to marriage of Zayd, alayhi salam, and because the slave was not groomed to live with a free slave.
Right. So that is a very pertinent question. That does make sense. So if the questioner is asking regarding Zayd, because of course, in that case, you see, in that case, you have to understand that he was no longer a slave. He was an emancipated slave. He was a slave in the past. He was a past slave, so to speak. So now he was a free individual. So Zainab was also a free individual. Yes, there was some disparity in the financial or social status of the two, but this is what the Prophet wanted to bridge. And this also shows that in spite of all his efforts and his desire, it was a marriage that failed because perhaps, yes, this was something which was not accepted by Zainab herself. We know that the disparity between the two was so vast, the gap was so vast, that there are hints in the Quran, we can discuss them, which show that the marriage was not even consummated. And Zayd was so, he was so far apart from Zainab, it never came to be consummated. And precisely that is why we know that the Quran has mentioned this directive that once you marry someone and you divorce that lady without the marriage being consummated, there is no iddat. You can immediately marry someone else, and precisely that is why the Prophet immediately married, or very soon married her, because she had no iddat, because there was no consummation. So yes, in a sense, the questioner is right in saying that this disparity was there, and maybe the Prophet, as a person, could have thought of it. But you see, something else was hovering over him, and that was that somehow he could uplift the standard of slaves in the society, so that if a past slave would marry a free woman, then somehow the concepts of people would change and somehow they would accommodate him. But in spite of all this, it didn't work out, which also shows that how at times the strategy of a prophet, in however much noble it might be, the intention might be noble, but these social factors are so important that they don't work in favor, and lo and behold, and they did not work. So yes, you are right in this way, whoever the person who's asking this question is, that this did not work out because of that very disparity that you're talking about. But what I would say overtook the Prophet in this regard was that emotion or that feeling that he would somehow uplift the marriage situation with its slaves. And remember, the other thing was, of course, that the issue of marriage with Zainab was not just with slavery. It was also because that practice or that age-old custom of not marrying the wife of his adopted son had to be done away with. So that too was something. So yes, that is the second part. But the first part, I mean, I would agree with the questioner that this disparity was there. But I mean, what the Prophet he looked upon it from another angle.
Thank you. Sir, आपने जो आयत कोट की और उसके बाद आपने कहा कि these were the 4 categories जिसमें से Prophet allowed थे.
Actually,
तो
3.
सर 3 categories, right sir? तो सर जनरल अंडरस्टैंडिंग ये है कि एक्चुअली इस आयत में जो नंबर ऑफ वाइफ्स थी, जब उन्होंने एक अपना कंसेंट दे दिया कि दे वांट टू रिमेन विद द प्रॉफिट आफ्टर दे वर गिवन द ऑप्शन, देन ये कहा गया था कि आप अब इनको चेंज नहीं कर सकते, बट द स्लेव गर्ल्स आर अलाउड. तो सर ये अंडरस्टैंडिंग में डिफरेंस है कुरान की आयत की?
नहीं, I mean, what exactly is the question?
तो क्वेश्चन इज कि ये जनरल अंडरस्टैंडिंग आयत की ये है कि फाइनली ये वाइफ्स ने अपना कंसेंट दे दिया आफ्टर, जब उन्हें ऑप्शन दी गई थी कि आप दुनिया ले लो या प्रॉफिट के साथ रहे, तो फिर उसके बाद ही वाज नॉट अलाउड टू लीव देम और डिवोर्स देम, एंड ही वाज नॉट
Yes.
अलाउड टू he was not allowed to marry other women, but he could have slave girls.
Yes, that is correct. But slave girls he could have married slave girls who are caught in a military campaign.
But sir, after that, was the number of wives confined to them, or was he allowed to to marry even after them in those 3 categories?
He was allowed, but this never happened. I mean, theoretically, he was allowed to marry anyone who belonged to these 3 categories. But practically, we know from history that these are all that he married. These are the wives that we know that he married. And all of them, they fell in one of these categories.
Right, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Saleem. I have a question myself. So was Maria radiallahu anha, did she always remain a slave, or was by the end of it?
She always remained a slave, and she preferred to remain a slave. She never demanded any freedom from the Prophet.
So she didn't request to get married without any right?
No, and she could not have gotten married to the Prophet, because this is what the Quran has stopped. He says that only those slave women he could have liberated and married who were caught in a military campaign. Women who were gifted to him by like the king of Egypt did so. He was not allowed to marry them, because how could he have ended up marrying someone you don't know who they are? Being a wife of the Prophet is something that had to be of a certain, it had to have a certain criteria. So, the Quran said that only when women who are caught in a military campaign, and they are made as slaves, only then, and they are slave women actually, only then you are able to liberate them and marry them. Women who are gifted to you and not given to you in a military campaign, they were originally not allowed to the Prophet. We can see from this verse.
Ruhi Rasul?
Assalamu alaikum, sir. Assalamu alaikum, sir.
Waalaikum assalam.
It seems from the lesson that it was only Hazrat Khadija who Hazur Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam married with his whole heart, and the rest of the ladies, they were pushed in his life. It gives this impression.
That is correct.
Right?
That is correct. The word push probably is not correct. All the others were incidental. They were governed by some directive or incident. For example, Salama and Hafsa were governed by the fact that a lot of widows were they were now present in the Arab society. So the Prophet took lead so that other believers would also marry widows to support the orphans. Zainab bint Jahash was married for this very purpose, that she was divorced by Zayd, and the only consolation that would have made her, I mean, once again, sane, I would say, was the marriage with the Prophet. And then the rest we have just discussed that, and they fell into those three categories that we have just described.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Saleem. Azil Qureshi, please go ahead. Please try to keep your question concise so you can get through the remaining.
So, another very strong argument that is made in this favor is that Prophet was left alone for the parental duties. He's also a prophet, and to take care of the children, he needed somebody like Sauda or Aisha. So Aisha would not have been 6 or 9 years old because a child cannot take care of other children.
Right.
So she must have been
Right.
some adult. So
Of course.
in the argument that is made by Ghamidi Saab is that the word 16 and 19 might have been misread or misplaced in these riwayats, and one would have been dropped. And this is why 6 or 9 is the figure that has been somehow read through the Chinese whisper. But the argument he makes, the first argument is actually a very strong one, that how can a child take care of other children? Why would you like?
I mean, that is the primary argument actually when you see that why would the Prophet at all attempt to marry a 9-year-old? I mean, he had children who were almost as old as Aisha or slightly younger, maybe, or some of them older. What exactly was in his mind that made him do so? So it's again, I mean, you can marry for consummation of marriage, you can marry someone for companionship, you can marry for someone for looking after the household. She could have done neither of these. So, I mean, it's against normal human practice to have done so. And this is in fact the primary reason. The historical reason that I furnished earlier on is just supporting evidence which shows that yes, common sense and human practice are the ones who stand against this marriage. And historically also we know that she was not that old. I mean, she was not a 9-year-old.
Right. So just the question was, what about the riwayat that you're saying that she used to play with dolls? So obviously a 16-year-old or 19-year-old probably would not play with.
I mean, we don't care about such narratives. I mean, of course, there must have been some mixing up by the narrators themselves. So you see, a lot of things happen with these narrations. We cannot accept a narrative which is against the Quran or against human practice or against common sense. This in itself is a principle which is coined by our muhaddisun or scholars of hadith.
Thank you, sir.
Bismillah Tirmizi, Ahmed, please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Saleem. I've joined the lesson late, so I don't know if you addressed this. How is it confirmed that Hazrat Khatija was 40 years old? Is there a chance that she was younger? Because I was reading, and I forget the name of the book. I was reading a book recently written by, I think it was an English scholar, and this is a few years ago, where it was stated that she was a beautiful woman and she was not that old. Is that a myth that's been created?
It could have been a myth because there are research scholars who have challenged this traditional narrative that she was 40 and the Prophet was 25. Actually, come to think of it, whether she was 40 or whether she was younger, it does not make much difference, except the fact that yes, she could have been younger at the time of marriage. And as I said, there are scholars who have challenged this narrative and they have shown that she was much younger. But whether she was, let's say, in her 30s or maybe close to the Prophet's age, it doesn't make that, I mean, a distinctive difference, I would say, in any way. All that it would do is, it would, if this research is correct, it would just add to our knowledge that she was not as old as 40. She was younger than that mature age. So that would not make something dramatically different overall.
But, you know, the reason I only say this is because I feel because they've given us this, we all absolutely, of course, adore the Prophet and we have such great respect for him, the greatest. My only concern is when people manipulate the age of Khatija, they try to give us an image of the Prophet, you know, somebody who's, you know, not of human capacity. If she was younger, then this gives us more of a realistic, it's a human-like thing to do, to want to marry somebody who's closer to your age, who's nice looking. So that even makes him, you know, that doesn't change anything, but I feel that's the distortion of the image. So that was the reason I asked the question.
Okay, but let me also point out something very subtle. I'm not exactly subtle, it's very apparent in some of the verses which I just read out. It says that the Prophet could not marry beyond this circle, that these three categories, وَلَوْ أَعْجَبَكَ حُسْنُهُنَّ, even if the beauty of some lady attracts him. which itself shows that beauty is something which, I mean, which could have been one of the reasons for which people marry. So you see, the Prophet is told, so you see, I mean, we just cannot subtract that human being portion from a person who is a human being as well. So this tells us that beauty in itself is something which is, or someone being attractive, someone who catches your eyes. There is nothing wrong with that. So the words are, I mean, these words have to be noted. It says, "Walau ajabaka husnuhunna." You just cannot marry beyond these three categories, even if the husn, even if the beauty of some other lady attracts you, which actually tells us that
she was also a package. She was supposed to be so intelligent. So I'm just saying, beauty is an addition, not that it was just that she was beautiful. She was supposed to be a.
So yes, of course, yes, of course. I mean, that is another thing. Whether she was an intellectual, or whether she was a businesswoman, or whether she was very a smart lady who would advise the Prophet in some things, and the Prophet also became very dearly attached to her. And we know that when she passed away, the Prophet would still send gifts and small things to her friends, as the attachment that he had. So you see, this is something that we have to understand, that age, I mean, as long as you are in the marriageable age, at the marriageable bracket, whatever the age, I mean, it's perfectly fine. People marry women who are older, people marry who are close to their age, people marry who are younger to their age. But underage marriages or child marriages, this is something which never happened, as has been alleged.
Actually choose any Muslim wali she likes instead of a mujbir wali.
Muslim wali in against who?
So if there is ijbar, does that mean that the wali, or who is being mujbir, actually has no place and the lady could take
What exactly? I mean, I couldn't get the word mujbir or mushrik.
mujbir.
So mujbir is someone who is compelled to do something. Is that what is being applied here? Mujbir is someone who's compelled, or someone who's compelling someone who's forcing someone.
I think that's what they're trying to ask. So if somebody is forcing a lady to do something, can she choose a different wali who she likes instead of?
I mean, she doesn't. I mean, she does not even have to have a wali in the first place as a condition for nikah. That's what I said earlier on. Normally, yes, people have their walis as their own fathers or their own, their own parents or their own, close relatives. So that is something which is a recommended thing. And so in the first case, as I said, marrying with the consent of a wali or to choose a wali in itself is not something of a requirement. You don't need to have a wali as a requirement of marriage. The requirement of marriages are two, stated very clearly, and we just studied them a couple of weeks ago. One of them is that you have to give meher, which is of course dowers, and second, that the lady that you are marrying and the relationship that you are going to enter into is going to be marriage, and you're not going to marry women who are given to adultery or who have paramours, muhsinina ghayra musafihin. So these are the two conditions which have been discussed. Other than that, all else is cultural at times and social and recommended, but none of them is mandatory.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saleem, for another very informative and very important session.